have our own myth makers in the African American historical establishment. All the Egyptians look like Michael Jordan. All our people were black gods and kings.
Most of us have believed or have been taught that the glories of the pharaohs could never have been created by African people or African ideas because, it's been said, Africans could never have built a high civilization. The Greeks knew Egypt well and firmly believed that the original Egyptians were black people who had come from the south to settle the land of the Nile.
We have our own myth makers in the African American historical establishment. All the Egyptians look like Michael Jordan.
But the Nile is more than a great river. It's a whole library of the history we're looking for. From the earliest times of human settlement along the river, some 10,000 years ago, the Nile was the giver of life to ancient communities who came to its banks and farmed on fertile soil that was enriched unfailingly, year by year, by the flood of silt. Those early people were among the ancestors of the Egyptians and the Sudanese of today. Others may have come from the Middle East, but the archaeological evidence combines to show that the main lines of incoming migration were from the southwest and the west. In other words, from the African communities of the Sahara.
All the Egyptians look like Michael Jordan.
And I imagine that most visitors conclude as they listen to their guides that a statue such as this of the young king Tutankhamun may have turned very black in the course of centuries, but could not have been a black man in the first place.
Du 19e siècle, voici dans le tombeau de Ramsès III, au 12e siècle avant Jésus-Christ, les 4 races connues des Égyptiens représentées sur le même plan. Ici, vous avez l'Égyptien, le type générique de la race, en noir charbon, si je puis dire, avec toutes ses particularités ethniques. Et sur le même tableau, vous avez le type indo-européen, représenté également, avec toutes ses différences par rapport au type égyptien, du point de vue de la couleur de la peau et du point de vue du vêtement. Et ici, vous avez les autres Africains qui habitaient à l'époque l'intérieur du continent, représentés de la même façon que les Égyptiens.
You know, we were not complicitous in the slave trade. There wouldn't be a slave trade. Africans sold other Africans to white people. That was the slave trade. That's the first thing we honestly have to admit. We are just as corrupt and despicable as any other people. And if we have the right to oppress, we will oppress just like the white man oppressed us. That is human nature. Unfortunately, that's just the way it is. And the only way to overcome that is to be honest about it. Admit the truth, and then all try to do better. As my main man, guy I admire so much, Cornel West, says, we're all recovering racists. We're all recovering racists.
For the most part, the ancient Egyptians had themselves portrayed as reddish pink. But of course, they intermarried with Asians, and even more with other Africans. Many of their noble ladies were Nubians, and lovingly portrayed as such. This painting comes from the tomb of Hemaka, clearly a black lady, with a handmaiden behind her, just as surely white. It followed that the royal children were often black as well, as was King Senusret, seen here wearing the white crown of Upper Egypt. Or this pharaoh, of unknown name, but obviously of high prestige in his time, and just as clearly African.
We have our own myth makers in the African American historical establishment. All the Egyptians look like Michael Jordan.
5,000 years ago, this homeland had already become the scene of a civilization in many ways unmatched anywhere else in the ancient world. This is where we have to begin, in the Egypt of the pharaohs, in the African land that was the gift of the god of the Nile. It's easy enough to believe, within these corridors, built to a gigantic scale and yet wonderfully proportioned, that you've entered a world sprung complete from the lap of the gods.
Egypt of the pharaohs was the greatest and the oldest and the most inventive of all the high civilizations of antiquity. And it flourished for 3,000 years. It set a pattern, an example for peoples near and far.
All the Egyptians looked like Michael Jordan.
And here is the most famous of those mighty kings of the south, recognized by the peoples of that time, the 7th century BC, as among the masters of the world. This one, as it happens, received a favorable mention in the Bible, in the Book of Kings, as the emperor of Kush and of all Egypt, whose name was Taharka. By 650 BC, the Nubian kings who had subdued Egypt were ready to withdraw to the south, to Napata.
DNA is finally shedding light on one of my family's greatest mysteries. Remember my second great-grandmother, Jane Gates, the woman whose house my cousin just bought? Jane, a slave, had 5 children with an Irishman. Yet she never told anyone his identity. But not even Jane's discretion, or perhaps her shame, could protect her children's father from modern science. Since this man is related to me on my direct paternal line, his Y-DNA haplotype, or genetic signature, and mine are exactly the same.
Guys, this is Professor Gates. He's tracing his roots using genetic genealogy. Tim, Trina, Anna, he's
Hi. How are you? Do I look like an Irishman to you? I'm here to find my roots. I've been looking for my roots. Looked all over Africa, couldn't find anybody, so I ended up here. After you, sir. This is my Y-DNA, which we brought.
Yes.
Maybe there's some pattern that you can ascertain in my DNA.
Well, we had a look at your marker profile here, and I can see here that some of these markers are markers that we've typed as well in our survey of Ireland, and matches don't happen by chance, really. Not over a large number of markers. 10 out of 11 match. Neil of the 9 hostages.
Neil of the 9 hostages.
Yeah, and Neil of the 9 hostages probably lived about 450 AD, so a long time ago, and he was a warlord.
Does this mean that I am descended from Nile of the 9 hostages?
It looks like a pretty typical Neil haplotype, yeah.
Wow, that's great. I'm surprised myself that I have a kinship relationship with this set of families and ultimately an individual. And that I have so much in common with them genetically is astonishing.
That's right. Yeah.
They gave me a DNA test yesterday, and I'm descended from Nile of the 9 hostages, the king.
Well, actually, I'm an O'Neill too, or married to O'Neill, and I believe that we were descended from the kings.
So your husband and I are cousins. How about that?
Delighted to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
Wish you well, and the best of luck. I hope you enjoy your stay here and find out plenty about your ancestors.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
I've only been Irish for 24 hours. It's a lot of fun. I like it. I was told I'm supposed to let Guinness settle, right? You have a coin, you're supposed to tap it?
No, wait till it gets black.
Oh, I like that. I came to Ireland in search of my great-great-grandfather. And now, compliments of DNA analysis, I've ended up with 3 million new cousins.
I'm only part Irish. I don't think I got the beer gene.
None of whom look quite like me.